Prudence Marlowe stepped off the noon stage at Grave Springs and, before the porter had set her carpetbag down, told the rancher in the plain gray coat waiting for her, in Latin, that he did not look at all like his letters. Ives Whitby, 34, plain sun-brown, unlettered past the third McGuffey, but a man who had listened to his older sister recite Ovid at the kitchen table for the whole of his boyhood, tipped his hat and said, in Latin, that he had not been aware that his letters had a look. Prudence Marlowe, 28, red-haired, straight-shouldered, in a plain travel-worn dress and a plain small bonnet, stopped very still on the depot boards. She said, in English, "Sir, you speak Latin." He said, "Ma'am, I speak Latin badly. I understand a great deal of it. My older sister Ruth was of the classical persuasion and taught school in Cincinnati 14 years and would practice her Cicero on me at the kitchen table when I was 7, and I could not stop her. I know as many sentences of Latin as I do of English. I use them in ordinary conversation with, I have been told by my Aunt Sylvia, a distressing regularity. I did not put it in my letters, because it seemed a boastful thing to put in a letter." Prudence Marlowe said, "Mr. Whitby." He said, "Prudence." She said, "Ives, may I ask you a plain thing?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Will you speak Latin at supper for as long as I am your wife?" Ives Whitby said, "Ma'am, if you can bear it." Prudence said, "I have been bearing it 15 years, teaching Latin at the Girls' Academy at Pittsburgh, sir. I have been advertising for a husband who would use it at supper for 8 years without a single application. Yours was the first application. I had considered you a fine long shot until this moment. I would like to marry you Wednesday, if that is acceptable." Ives Whitby said, "Ma'am, it is acceptable." He drove her to his ranch that afternoon. It was a plain, modest ranch with a plain, solid house and a plain plank supper table. His Aunt Sylvia was on the porch with a plate of biscuits and a book of Horace. She stood up when Ives handed Prudence down from the buckboard. "Ma'am," Aunt Sylvia said, in Latin, with the plain composure of a woman who had been reciting Latin at supper since she was 6 years old, "you are welcome to this house and to my nephew's table. He has been waiting for you 8 years and did not know it until Tuesday of last week." Prudence answered in Latin, without pausing to think. She said that 8 years of waiting was a small price for the arrival of a household in which she could speak the language of her mother at supper without apology. Aunt Sylvia said, "Then we shall get on." They got on. The county judge married Ives Whitby and Prudence Marlowe at the county courthouse in Grave Springs on the last Wednesday of May. Aunt Sylvia stood witness in a plain green Sunday dress and a small pin at her collar that had been her mother's. The judge, who spoke only English and was a plain, honest man, was a little put out that the vows before the exchange of rings were repeated in Latin at Prudence's request, but he told his wife at supper that night, been amused enough by the young couple's plain, honest pleasure in each other to permit it. Aunt Sylvia read the Beatitudes at the wedding from her small pocket copy of the Vulgate. She read them in Latin. She read them slowly. Prudence wept once at Beati Misericordes. Ives put his rough hand along her cheek. They drove home in the yellow afternoon. At the plank table that first evening, Ives asked Prudence, in Latin, whether she would care for milk with her coffee. Prudence answered, in Latin, that she would not. Aunt Sylvia, at the head of the table, said in Latin that she was going to bed early on account of a small headache, and that the young people were welcome to the whole parlor and the whole evening in whatever language they wished. She went to bed. She was, in fact, not the least bit tired. She was simply the sort of aunt who knew when to leave a young couple to a plank table. Ives Whitby said, in English, Prudence. Prudence said, Ives. He said, I would like to say a plain thing that requires English. She said, please. He said, I have wanted, since the depot boards at 11:42 this morning, to tell you the plainer reason I put my advertisement in the classical column of the Ladies' Journal at Pittsburgh. It was not a random column. I put it there because I had been reading that journal for 4 years. My sister Ruth sends me every issue, and I had noticed that the classical column advertisements were the ones written by women who spoke Latin at supper. I had never met one. I had been advertising to meet one, That is the plainer reason I wanted you to know. Prudence Marlowe Whitby said, Ives. He said, yes. She said, you are a very well-planned man. He said, my sister planned me. She laughed once. He laughed once. They drank the coffee. They spoke in Latin for another hour. And then, when Prudence's Latin ran out because it had been a long day, they spoke in English until the fire went low. Prudence took the Grave Springs schoolmistress position in September of that year. She taught the county's children Latin twice a week, and English the rest of the days, and arithmetic 4 days out of 5. And by the end of her second term, the smallest boy at the Grave Springs school could parse a sentence of Virgil's Aeneid with only 3 prompts. His name was Sinclair Weller. He was 10. His father, old Weller of the Mercantile, could not read English or Latin, and wept once at supper, the Sunday Sinclair recited the parsing at the plank table. In the winter of the 3rd year, Aunt Sylvia caught a lung sickness in December and was slow to recover. Prudence, who had learned nursing from her grandmother in Boston, sat with her 3 weeks. Aunt Sylvia recovered. Aunt Sylvia said, from her bed on the day she rose again, in Latin, niece, you are the finest gift the Lord has given this ranch since my brother built the porch step. Prudence said, Aunt. Aunt Sylvia said, I mean it plainly. I have known this house 61 years. Prudence kissed the old woman's dry cheek. 3 years on a warm September evening at the Whitby Ranch, Prudence Whitby sat on the porch step with Ives beside her and their small daughter Sylvia, 10 months old, asleep against Prudence's chest. Ives was reading the county paper aloud to his wife, in the ordinary voice a man reads a paper in. He was reading in English. Aunt Sylvia, in the rocker on the porch, was reading the same paper in her lap in Latin, which was her private habit, because she said the English of newspapers was often lazy, and Latin fixed it. Ives put the paper down. He said, Prudence. She said, Ives. He said, in your original letter of March 14th last year, you enclosed a translation of a Horace ode. I have not, in 3 years of marriage, told you that I have kept that translation on my mantel in a small wooden frame. Prudence Marlowe Whitby looked at her husband. She said, Ives. Which ode? He said, Book 2, Ode 10. She said, the one about the middle way, about keeping to the moderate course between the pines on the exposed slope and the shore of the low tide. He said, that one. She said, that was the first Horace ode my mother taught me. My mother said the middle way was the way a widow raises a girl in Pittsburgh who wants to teach Latin at supper. I did not know my mother knew what I would become. I have thought about that ode every year since. I've said, so have I, for 3 years. Please write me another one. Prudence Marlowe Whitby laughed once. She kissed her husband's temple. Aunt Sylvia, from the rocker, said, in Latin, not now, my dears. Not now. The baby is asleep. Save the ode for morning. Prudence said, in Latin, yes, Aunt. Ives said, in Latin, yes, Aunt. The pasture went to gold. The evening deepened. Somewhere in the yard a small crickety insect began the small Latin of its own species. And Prudence Marlowe Whitby, who had stepped off a noon stage at Grave Springs 3 years back and had told the plain gray rancher waiting for her, in Latin, that he did not look at all like his letters, put her cheek against her husband's cheek and understood that the good slow country had, in its good slow way, arranged for the reader of a Pittsburgh Journal's classical column to advertise for a wife who spoke the language of Sincero at supper, and had, in that plain honest arrangement, given her back not just the classroom of Grave Springs and the plank table of the Whitby Ranch, but the whole rest of a household in which she could speak, at supper, the language she had loved since her mother had first taught it to her. And so it had.